He smashed the 1982 vintage against the wall right next to my head, and I didn't scream. The next morning, he walked into the kitchen with that smug grin, thinking I had spent the night scrubbing the floor in repentance. I poured his coffee with a steady hand, placing the silver spoon exactly where he liked it. His smile froze when he saw Sheriff Miller sitting at the head of our table, eating a biscuit. He realized too late that my silence wasn't submission, but a verdict. You know how silence sounds different in a house built on fear, don't you? It is not the peaceful silence of a library or a church, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb waiting to detonate. Imagine a beautiful estate in Napa Valley, where the grapevines stretch out like green veins under the golden California sun, and the air always smells of fermentation and old money. That was my world. A picture-perfect postcard that everyone envied, but nobody saw the rot hiding beneath the expensive oak barrels. I was the curator of his life, the woman who polished the silverware and smiled for the cameras, convincing the world that his temper was just the eccentricity of a genius wine connoisseur. I sacrificed my voice, piece by piece, believing that if I just loved him enough, if I just aged like the fine wine he adored, the bitterness in him would eventually turn sweet. But last night, when the glass shattered against the wall, something inside me finally broke along with it, and I realized that you cannot filter poison out of a bad vintage. The morning sun filtered through the French windows of our breakfast nook, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany table that I had polished just hours before. Richard came down the stairs with the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man nursing a hangover, the smell of stale whiskey and expensive cologne trailing behind him like a toxic cloud. I was standing by the stove, flipping bacon with a mechanical precision. My back turned to him so he couldn't see the way my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of what I had done. He cleared his throat, a sound that used to make my stomach tighten in anticipation of a criticism, but today it just sounded pathetic and small. He probably expected to find me red-eyed and weeping, or perhaps still on my knees in the dining room, picking up the microscopic shards of green glass he had made me clean until 3 a.m. Instead, the kitchen was spotless. The aroma of freshly brewed Arabica coffee filled the air, and I was dressed in my stiffest, most formal Sunday dress, the high collar hiding the bruising on my neck and the long sleeves covering the bandages on my arms. He walked to his usual spot at the head of the table, rubbing his temples as if he were the victim, as if the headache he gave himself was a tragedy equal to the terror he had inflicted on me. He pulled out his chair, the wood scraping harshly against the floor, and that was when he finally looked up and saw that the table was set for 3, not 2. Sitting opposite him, calm and imposing in his beige uniform, was Sheriff Miller, a man Richard considered a drinking buddy, a man he thought he owned with gifts of rare scotch and cigars. Richard blinked, his bloodshot eyes widening in confusion, his mouth opening to form a joke or a greeting, but the words died in his throat when he saw the look on Miller's face. It wasn't the friendly look of a guest dropping by for coffee, but the stony, unreadable expression of the law. I walked over with the coffee pot, the heat radiating from the silver vessel warming my cold fingers, and I poured a cup for the sheriff first, ignoring Richard completely. The steam rose between us, a barrier of mist, and I could feel Richard's gaze burning into the side of my face, a mixture of shock and rising anger. He looked at the sheriff, then at me, waiting for an explanation, waiting for me to apologize for the intrusion, but I just placed the sugar bowl in the center of the table. You see, Richard always believed that he could control the narrative, that his charm could smooth over any domestic misunderstanding, but he didn't know that the narrative had changed the moment that bottle left his hand. Let me take you back to the moment the clock stopped, to the incident that turned this house from a home into a crime scene. It was only 12 hours ago, but it feels like a lifetime has passed since I was that foolish woman trying to save a special occasion. We were celebrating, or at least I was trying to celebrate, the 10th anniversary of the day we met, and I had brought up the Chateau Margaux 1982 from the cellar. It was the bottle he had bought on our honeymoon, the one he said represented the depth of our love, complex and enduring. But Richard had come home already drunk, his mood foul from a deal that had fallen through, and he looked at the bottle not with nostalgia, but with disdain. He told me I had no palate, that I was wasting a masterpiece on a Tuesday night, that I was too stupid to understand the value of patience. I tried to argue. I tried to tell him that we were the masterpiece, but he just laughed, a cruel, jagged sound that cut deeper than any knife. He grabbed the bottle by the neck, and for a second, I thought he was going to pour it. But then I saw the darkness in his eyes, the total absence of the man I loved. He didn't throw it at the floor. He threw it at the wall directly behind my head, with enough force to embed glass into the plaster. The sound of the explosion was deafening, a thundercrack of glass and wine that sent a spray of red liquid and sharp shrapnel showering over me. I felt the sting before I felt the pain. Tiny razor blades slicing into my shoulder and cheek, the warm trickle of blood mixing with the cold splash of vintage wine. I stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer violence of the act, while the red stain dripped down the white wall like a gruesome, abstract painting. Richard didn't rush to see if I was hurt. He didn't gasp in horror at what he had done. Instead, he looked at the stain on the wall and sighed with annoyance. He told me that I had made a mess, that I was clumsy for provoking him, and then he gave the order that haunts me still. He pointed to the floor, where jagged pieces of green glass lay scattered like caltrops, and told me to clean it up immediately, before the wine stained his precious oak floorboards. He sat in the armchair, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, and watched me get on my hands and knees. I was barefoot. I remember the coldness of the wood and the sharp bite of glass under my skin, but I didn't make a sound. I picked up every piece, my own blood dripping onto the floor, which I then had to wipe away, blurring the line between the wine and my life force. That night, as I lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, listening to his heavy snoring from across the hall, something shifted in the tectonic plates of my soul. I touched the bandage on my cheek, the physical proof that this wasn't just a bad temper, but a systematic destruction of my being. I looked at the photos on the dresser, images of a smiling couple in vineyards and at galas, and I realized they were photos of a hostage and her captor. The fear that had always kept me paralyzed, the fear of his anger, the fear of scandal, the fear of being alone, suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I realized that if I stayed, I would eventually die. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but he would kill the person I was until only a shell remained. I got up before dawn, not to pack a bag and run away into the night like a frightened animal, but to prepare for a confrontation. I went to the kitchen and started cooking, preparing a breakfast that was fit for a king, or perhaps a condemned man. I called Sheriff Miller at 5 a.m., my voice steady and devoid of tears, and I told him, "You need to come over for breakfast. Richard has something to show you." I didn't tell him about the abuse. I didn't scream for help. I knew that for men like Richard, the public humiliation of a witness was far more damaging than any private accusation. Back at the table, the tension was thick enough to choke on, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the sheriff stirring his coffee. Richard finally found his voice, a rough, shaky sound that tried to be authoritative but failed miserably. He asked Miller what brought him here so early, trying to force a laugh, trying to re-establish the camaraderie of the boys' club. Miller didn't laugh. He just looked at Richard over the rim of his cup and said, "Elena invited me, Richard. She said you had a little accident last night." Richard's eyes darted to me, filled with a sudden, sharp panic, realizing that I had broken the cardinal rule of our marriage. I had let the outside world in. I didn't look at him. I just placed a plate of biscuits in front of the sheriff, and then, with deliberate slowness, I turned my back to them to pick up the teapot. As I turned, the morning sun hit the back of my dress, and I knew that the movement caused the fabric to pull tight against the bandages underneath, a subtle hint of the carnage he had wrought. I poured tea for myself, the liquid dark and bitter, and I finally spoke, my voice soft but carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "Richard was just telling me," I lied smoothly, looking the sheriff in the eye, "how much he regrets the damage to the wall. He wanted you to see it, just to be sure the structural integrity of the house is safe." Richard's face went pale, his jaw slack, as he realized the trap I had sprung. He knew, and I knew, that the wall was still covered in wine and blood, a mural of his guilt that he had been too drunk to clean. And now, there was a witness. The heavy oak door to the master bedroom clicked shut, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the hollow silence of the hallway, leaving me alone with the wreckage of our anniversary. I didn't cry, because tears would have blurred my vision, and I needed to see every microscopic shard of green glass that littered the floor like invisible landmines waiting for my skin. I dropped to my knees, the hardwood digging into my bruising flesh, and dipped the rag into the bucket of soapy water which had already turned a sickening shade of pink. The smell of the spilled Chateau Margaux was overpowering, a cloying mix of dark fruit and fermentation that now smelled unmistakably like old blood, filling my nose and making my stomach churn with nausea. I scrubbed the baseboards with a frantic, mechanical rhythm, my arm moving back and forth like a piston, desperate to erase the stain before it could seep into the grain of the wood and become permanent. Every time I inhaled, my ribs ached from where he had shoved me days ago, a phantom pain that mingled with the fresh sting of the glass cuts on my back. I was not a wife in that moment. I was a crime scene cleaner, erasing the evidence of my own murder while the killer slept soundly just upstairs. As I crawled forward to reach a splatter near the console table, the motion sensor on the digital photo frame flickered to life, illuminating the dark room with a sudden, ghostly glow. It cycled through our memories, mocking me with high-definition happiness, landing on a photo from our honeymoon in Bordeaux, where we stood amidst the golden vines of France. I stopped scrubbing, the rag dripping crimson onto my lap, and stared at the man in the picture who held me as if I were a rare, fragile artifact that he had spent a fortune to acquire. I remembered the warmth of his hand on the small of my back, the way he whispered that I was his vintage, his prize, and that he would build me a castle where we would age together in perfect harmony. He had been so charming then, so full of promises that tasted like sweet nectar, convincing me that his possessiveness was just a symptom of his overwhelming passion for me. I touched the cold screen, tracing the smile on my younger self's face, a girl who believed that love was a fairy tale, not realizing that some castles are actually dungeons built with expensive stones. That girl didn't know that the patience he spoke of was actually a test of endurance, and the aging he desired was just a process of breaking my spirit until I was soft enough to mold. The photo shifted to another image, this one of us at a charity gala, where I wore diamonds that felt like a collar and he wore a tuxedo like a suit of armor. I looked at his eyes in the picture, really looked at them for the first time, and I saw the emptiness that I had mistaken for depth. He didn't love the wine. He loved the prestige of owning it. He didn't love me. He loved the way I looked on his arm, a silent accessory that shone brightly but never spoke out of turn. The realization hit me harder than the bottle had, a cold wave of clarity that washed away the excuses I had been making for him for 3 long, agonizing years. I had spent so many nights wondering what I had done wrong, trying to adjust my flavor to suit his palate, trying to be sweeter, softer, quieter. But looking at the dark stain on the wall, I realized that some vintages do not improve with age. They simply turn to vinegar and rot from the inside out, poisoning everything they touch. He was not a connoisseur. He was a consumer, and he had consumed every ounce of joy I had until I was empty, hollow, and dry. I stood up, wincing as a sliver of glass pressed deeper into my heel, and I walked to the window to look out at the moonlit vineyard that stretched to the horizon. The impulse to run surged through me, a primal urge to pack a bag, steal the car, and drive until the gas tank was empty, and this house was just a bad memory. I looked at the suitcase tucked in the corner of the mudroom, the one I kept half-packed with emergency cash and a change of clothes, and for a moment, my hand hovered over the handle. But then I looked back at the stairs, and I imagined him waking up to find me gone, imagined the hunt, the phone calls, the way he would spin the story to make me look unstable, ungrateful, and crazy. If I ran, I would be the fugitive in his narrative, the hysterical woman who abandoned her loving husband, and he would remain the saint, the victim, the lonely king in his tower. No, I thought, tightening my grip on the wet rag until my knuckles turned white. I would not give him the satisfaction of chasing me. I turned away from the door and walked back to the kitchen, my footsteps silent and deliberate, my mind sharpening into a weapon. I would not leave this house. I would clean it, I would cook breakfast, and I would serve him the justice he deserved on a silver platter. 3 years ago, the rot began not with a fist, but with a frost that killed the harvest and froze his heart. I remember standing on the veranda, watching the black ice coat the vines like a funeral shroud, destroying the vintage before it could even begin to grow. Richard stood beside me, not holding my hand for comfort, but gripping the railing until his knuckles turned the color of bone. That was the year the bank account started to bleed, and the man who once recited poetry about the soil began to speak only in the language of debt and resentment. He didn't hit me then, for the violence was still a seed buried deep in the soil of his frustration, but he began to prune me like an unruly branch. He told me that my laughter was too loud for a house in mourning, that my desire for new curtains was an insult to his financial genius, and that I was a parasite feeding on a dying host. I tried to be smaller. I tried to consume less, believing that if I could just shrink myself down to nothing, I would no longer be a burden on his crumbling empire. I didn't know then that a man who loses his kingdom will always look for a subject to punish, and I was the only citizen left within his walls. The financial abuse started so subtly that I mistook it for prudence, a necessary tightening of the belt to save our legacy. He took away my credit cards, claiming that the interest rates were criminal, and gave me a weekly allowance in cash that a teenager would find insulting. I remember standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, my face burning with shame, as I counted out quarters to pay for a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. He would audit the receipts every Friday night, sitting at his desk with a glass of cheap whiskey, circling every item he deemed unnecessary with a red pen that looked like a scalpel. He screamed at me for buying a brand of shampoo that cost $2 more than the generic, accusing me of trying to bankrupt him with my vanity. He made me beg for money to buy feminine products. He made me explain why I needed gas for the car, and he made me feel like a thief in my own home. I learned to hide a few dollars here and there, tucking bills inside hollow curtain rods or taping them under drawers, creating a pathetic little stash that I told myself was for emergencies. But the real emergency was sitting in the study, drinking away our savings while accusing me of ruining us. The first time he humiliated me in public, it wasn't with a blow, but with a splash of liquid that stained my soul deeper than the silk. We were hosting a dinner for the few investors who still believed in his vision, and I was wearing a cream-colored dress that I had bought years ago, before the frost. The conversation had turned to the subtle notes of a Cabernet, and I made the mistake of offering an opinion, saying that I tasted a hint of blackberry in the finish. The room went silent, the guests looking from me to him, waiting for his approval, but his face twisted into a mask of pure loathing. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound, and said to the table, "Elena wouldn't know a blackberry from a beetle. She has the palate of a peasant." When I tried to laugh it off, to save his dignity and mine, he picked up his glass and flicked his wrist, sending a wave of dark red wine across the front of my dress. It wasn't an accident. It was a marking, a way of showing the world that I was flawed, dirty, and his to ruin. He didn't apologize. He simply told me to go upstairs and change before I embarrassed him further, and the guests, those cowards in expensive suits, just looked down at their plates and kept eating. I sat in the kitchen now, the memory of that night burning in my chest, and I looked at the dark, silent house around me. For 3 years, I had accepted the blame. I had swallowed the insults like bitter medicine, believing that if I just loved him enough, I could cure the sickness in his soul. But sitting here in the cold light of 4 a.m., with the smell of cleaning bleach stinging my nose, I realized that my silence had not been a cure, but a fertilizer. I had watered the weeds of his cruelty with my tears. I had fed the monster with my apologies, and I had allowed him to believe that he was righteous in his tyranny. He didn't hate me because I was wasteful. He didn't hit me because I was clumsy. He did these things because he was weak, and making me feel small was the only way he could feel big. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, seeing the tired woman with the bruised cheek, and I decided that the time for silence was over. I was done being the scapegoat for his failures. I was done being the punching bag for his insecurities, and I was done protecting a reputation that was built on lies. I stood up, my legs stiff but steady, and I walked to the heavy oak door that led down to the wine cellar, the holy of holies where he kept his most prized possessions. The air down there was cool and damp, smelling of earth and time, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the kitchen I had just scrubbed. I walked past the rows of dusty bottles, thousands of dollars of liquid trapped in glass, ignoring the cheap table wine he drank daily and heading for the private reserve. I wasn't there to drink. I was there to curate the final exhibit for the trial that would take place at breakfast. I ran my fingers over the labels, looking for specific vintages, looking for the bottles that told the story of our marriage better than words ever could. I found a bottle from the year of the frost, the wine thin and acidic, just like his temper. I found a bottle from the year he first hit me, a heavy, overpowering red with a high alcohol content. I gathered them in my arms, not caring if they clinked together, not caring if I woke the ghost of the man he used to be. I carried them upstairs like ammunition, placing them on the sidebar in the dining room, ready to be uncorked, not for pleasure, but for evidence. The preparations were nearly complete, but there was one final element needed to turn this breakfast into a true judgment day. I needed to cook, but not the simple eggs and toast that he expected. I needed to make a meal that smelled of memory and regret. I opened the refrigerator and took out the ingredients for the truffled eggs Benedict, the dish he had ordered for me the morning after our wedding, the dish that represented a promise of luxury and care. As I whisked the hollandaise sauce, the rhythmic motion of the whisk against the metal bowl felt like a countdown, a ticking clock leading to 0 hour. My back throbbed with every movement, the cuts from the glass stinging under the fabric of my dress. But I welcomed the pain. The pain was fuel. The pain was a reminder of why I couldn't back down, why I couldn't let him charm his way out of this one last time. I set the table with the finest china, the plates with the gold rim that we hadn't used since the investors stopped coming. I folded the napkins into intricate swans, just as I had learned to do for his mother, ensuring that everything looked perfect, absolutely perfect. Because when the sheriff walked through that door, the contrast between the beauty of the table and the ugliness of the truth needed to be blinding. The clock on the mantel had chimed 11 times, each hollow ring amplifying the silence of the room where the candles had already burned down to waxy stumps. I had roasted a duck, his favorite, glazing the skin with honey and orange until it gleamed like amber under the dim lights, but now the fat had congealed into a cold, unappetizing gray film. The headlights swept across the living room wall like prison searchlights, signaling his arrival not with a sense of relief, but with a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that made my hands shake. He fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity, the metallic scratching of the key against the brass plate serving as a warning siren that the storm had finally made landfall. When the door swung open, it didn't reveal a husband returning to his loving wife, but a dark silhouette reeking of scotch and stale cigar smoke, swaying slightly as he crossed the threshold. He didn't look at the dinner. He didn't look at the dress I had worn for him. His eyes went straight to the uncorked bottle of Chateau Margaux, 1982, sitting in the center of the table, and his expression wasn't one of joy, but of pure, unadulterated contempt. He marched over to the table, his heavy boots leaving muddy prints on the Persian rug I had just vacuumed, and grabbed the neck of the precious bottle with a rough, disrespectful grip. I stood up, my voice trembling as I tried to remind him that this was the wine from our wedding, the vintage we had promised to open only when we were truly happy. I reached out a hand, a foolish and desperate gesture, to gently cover his fingers, whispering that we should save it for a better moment, perhaps when he was sober enough to taste the notes of currant and cedar. He slapped my hand away, not with a closed fist, but with a dismissive backhand that stung more than a punch, looking at me as if I were a cockroach crawling across his dinner plate. He sneered, his breath hot and acrid, telling me that wine was for drinking, not for gathering dust in a shrine dedicated to a marriage that had been dead for years. He poured a glass, filling it to the brim like it was cheap soda, and swirled it violently, spilling crimson droplets onto the white tablecloth, staining the fabric like fresh arterial blood. "You don't even know what you're drinking," he slurred, pointing a finger in my face. "You think this bottle makes us special, but it just proves how pathetic you are for holding on to the past." I pleaded with him to stop, my dignity crumbling as I begged him not to destroy the one tangible memory of the man he used to be. But my tears only seemed to fuel his disgust. He looked at the glass in his hand, then at the bottle, and finally at me, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, malicious calculation that turned my blood to ice. He didn't take a sip. Instead, He hurled the heavy bottle across the room with a terrifying, explosive force, aiming not at the floor, but directly at the wall beside my head. The sound of the impact was a deafening crash that seemed to shatter the very foundation of the house, sending a shower of green glass and dark red wine erupting outward like a grenade. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my shoulder and across my cheek, a sensation like being stung by a swarm of angry hornets, as the shards sliced through silk and skin alike. I gasped, bringing my hands up to my face, feeling the warm, wet stickiness of blood mixing with the cool vintage, while the red stain on the wall dripped down slowly, looking exactly like a gunshot wound to the head. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of the wine onto the hardwood floor and the ragged sound of my own breathing. I waited for the apology, for the look of horror that would surely come when he saw the blood running down my arm, but Richard simply stared at the mess with an expression of mild annoyance. He walked over to where I stood, crunching broken glass under his boots, and leaned in close, examining the wall where the plaster had been gouged by the impact. "Look what you made me do," he whispered, shifting the blame with the ease of a sociopath. "You always have to push, don't you, until something breaks." He didn't offer me a towel. He didn't check my eyes for shock. Instead, he looked down at the expensive oak floorboards and frowned at the pooling liquid. "Clean this up," he commanded, turning his back on me to walk toward the stairs. "And don't leave a single scratch on this wood, or you'll wish the bottle had hit you instead." I watched him ascend the stairs, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the wall, until the bedroom door clicked shut and I was left alone in the ruins of the dining room. The pain in my shoulder began to throb in time with my heartbeat, a dull and persistent ache that radiated down to my fingertips, but I didn't move to treat it. I looked at the shattered remains of the 1982 vintage, the glass glistening in the candlelight like diamonds in a slaughterhouse, and I realized that he was right about one thing. The marriage was dead, killed not by time or indifference, but by the violence of a man who loved his reflection more than his wife. I slowly knelt down, ignoring the sharp bite of glass against my knees, and began to pick up the pieces, not to repair what was broken, but to clear the way for what had to happen next. This was the moment the tears stopped, the moment the fear evaporated into a cold, hard resolve, and the moment I decided that if he wanted a spotless floor, I would give him one, but I would also give him a spotless, undeniable reckoning. The bathroom mirror was bright and unforgiving, illuminated by harsh fluorescent bulbs that hummed with a low, buzzing frequency, casting no shadows to hide the truth of what stared back at me. I stripped off the wine-soaked dress, the silk clinging to my skin like a second layer of flesh, and let it drop into the hamper with a heavy, wet thud that sounded final. My reflection was a map of violence, a geography of pain where purple bruises bloomed like dark storm clouds across my shoulder, and thin, angry red lines crisscrossed my left cheek where the glass had kissed me. I didn't flinch as I reached for the tweezers, my hand steady despite the tremors in my legs, and began the meticulous work of extracting the remaining shards from my skin. Each pull was a sharp, biting sting, a reminder of the man sleeping upstairs. But I welcomed the pain because it sharpened my focus, turning the chaos of the night into a cold, hard equation that I needed to solve. I cleaned the wounds with rubbing alcohol, the liquid burning as it sanitized the cuts, and then I picked up my phone, not to call 911, but to open the camera app. I turned my body, angling the light to catch the depth of the bruising, and snapped photo after photo, documenting every inch of damage with the detachment of a forensic pathologist. These weren't selfies. They were evidence. They were leverage. And they were the first bricks in the prison wall I was building for him. Once the wounds were dressed and covered with waterproof bandages that blended into my skin tone, I walked quietly to the walk-in closet in the guest room, where my escape plan had been gathering dust for months. The navy blue suitcase sat in the corner, packed with a few changes of clothes, a wad of cash I had skimmed from the grocery budget, and a photocopy of my passport, a pathetic little survival kit for a woman on the run. I stared at it for a long moment, imagining myself driving down the interstate as the sun came up, constantly checking the rearview mirror, living in cheap motels, and jumping at every shadow. If I left now, I would be safe for a day, maybe a week. But Richard would spin the story, telling everyone I had a breakdown, that I was unstable, that I had abandoned him without cause. He would be the grieving husband, the victim of a crazy wife, and he would keep the house, the money, and his pristine reputation while I became a ghost. No, I thought, gripping the handle of the suitcase until my knuckles turned white. Running away is what victims do, and I am done being a victim. I unzipped the bag, the sound loud in the quiet room, and deliberately unpacked every single item, placing them back into the drawers with slow, deliberate movements. I was staying, not because I was weak, but because this was my battleground, and I wasn't leaving until I had burned his kingdom to the ground. I moved to the kitchen, the nerve center of the house, where the digital clock on the oven read 5:15 a.m., the darkest hour before the dawn broke over the vineyard. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic settling of the foundation, a deceptive peace that masked the violence of the night before. I sat at the island, my phone resting on the cold granite countertop, and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Sheriff Miller. He was Richard's friend, his drinking buddy, the man who had overlooked noise complaints in the past because Richard donated generously to the Police Benevolent Fund. Calling him was a gamble, a calculated risk that required me to play the role of the concerned, slightly confused wife rather than the accuser, at least for now. I pressed the call button, listening to the rings. 1, 2, 3, before a groggy voice answered, thick with sleep and irritation. "Sheriff Miller," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "It's Elena, Richard's wife. I'm so sorry to wake you. But Richard, he's in a state, and he specifically asked for you to come over before the sun comes up." I paused, letting the silence hang there, knowing that Miller's curiosity would outweigh his annoyance. He said something about the wall, about showing you the structural damage. "Please, just come for coffee. Don't use the siren, you know how he hates the neighbors talking." The second call was harder, not because of strategy, but because it required me to invite the two people Richard feared most in this world, his parents. The Lowells were old money, strict Presbyterians who believed that appearance was everything and that a man's worth was measured by his ability to control his household. They had always looked down on me as new money, but they looked down on Richard even more for his failures, for his drinking, for his inability to live up to the Lowell name. If they saw him like this, hungover, abusive, with their family home turned into a slaughterhouse of wine and glass, they would cut him off faster than a withered vine. I dialed his mother's number, knowing she would be awake for her early morning prayers, and put on my best dutiful daughter-in-law voice. "Margaret," I said sweetly when she picked up, "it's Elena. I know it's early, but we've decided to host a spontaneous anniversary brunch this morning. Richard has a big announcement about the winery, and he insisted you and Father be here." I lied through my teeth, painting a picture of celebration, knowing that the disappointment they would feel when they arrived would be catastrophic for Richard. "Please come by 8. We're making your favorite Eggs Benedict. It wouldn't be a celebration without you." I placed the phone down, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the deception, but I forced myself to take a deep, steadying breath. The trap was set, the players were moving into position, and now all I had to do was set the stage for the final act. I walked to the pantry and pulled out the flour, the eggs, the butter, moving with the efficiency of a chef preparing for the dinner rush, ignoring the throbbing pain in my shoulder. I needed the house to smell like heaven when they walked in, a scent of butter and toasted English muffins that would clash violently with the visual reality of the bruises on my face. This was domestic warfare, fought not with guns, but with perceptions, with the juxtaposition of the perfect home and the hidden monster. I tied my apron tight around my waist, cinching it like a corset to hold myself together, and began to whisk the eggs, the rhythmic metal-on-glass sound echoing like a war drum. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked as Richard shifted in his sleep, unaware that his judge, jury, and executioners were already on their way. I wasn't just cooking breakfast. I was cooking his demise, simmering it slowly over a low heat, ensuring that when he finally took a bite, it would be the bitterest meal of his life. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, matching the colors on my skin. I went to the dining room one last time to check the exhibit, making sure the lighting was just right to highlight the stain on the wall without being too obvious. I left the shards of glass I had swept up in a clear pile near the baseboard. a small, dangerous monument to his rage that I would accidentally point out later. I went back to the kitchen, checked my reflection in the oven door, and adjusted my hair to cover the worst of the swelling, leaving just enough visible to spark a question, but not enough to scream for help. The art of the reveal was in the timing, in letting them discover the horror for themselves rather than shoving it in their faces. I heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel, the sheriff arriving early as I had hoped, his curiosity piquing him to drive faster. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression that didn't reach my eyes, and turned on the coffee grinder, the loud, mechanical shriek drowning out the last remnants of the woman I used to be. The coffee grinder whirred to a halt, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in the kitchen that was immediately broken by the heavy, authoritative sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I wiped my damp hands on the starched white apron, smoothing the fabric over my hips, and checked my reflection in the chrome toaster one last time to ensure the high collar of my dress completely concealed the purple bruises blooming on my neck like dark orchids. The heavy oak door felt cold under my palm as I pulled it open, revealing Sheriff Miller standing on the porch, his thumbs hooked into his belt, his eyes scanning the hallway behind me with the instinctive suspicion of a man who has seen too many domestic disputes end in tragedy. "Morning, Elena," he grunted, stepping inside as I stepped back, bringing with him the smell of fresh rain and gun oil. "Richard called me?" he sounded. "Urgent." I nodded, offering him a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach my eyes, and gestured for him to follow me to the kitchen, walking with a slight, deliberate limp that I tried, but failed, to hide. I could feel his gaze burning into my back, analyzing my stiff posture, noting the way I favored my left leg, and I knew the seeds of doubt were already taking root in his mind, just as I had planned. The kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth and light, filled with the comforting aroma of roasting coffee and sizzling bacon, a sensory illusion designed to mask the lingering metallic scent of the violence that had occurred just hours before. I poured Miller a cup of black coffee, placing it on a coaster to protect the granite, my movements precise and mechanical, like a surgeon preparing for an operation rather than a housewife serving a guest. "Richard will be down in a moment," I said softly, turning away to check the hollandaise sauce, deliberately letting the long sleeve of my dress ride up just enough to reveal the jagged edge of a fresh white bandage on my wrist. Miller cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet room, and asked, "Everything okay here, Elena? You look a little worn out, if you don't mind me saying." I froze for a split second, my hand hovering over the whisk, then pulled my sleeve down quickly, as if ashamed of the mark, and whispered, "Just a long night. Sheriff, you know how passionate Richard gets about his wine collection. Accidents happen when he's spirited." It was the truth, yet a lie, a carefully constructed sentence meant to lead him to the wrong conclusion before I showed him the right one, planting the idea of Richard's volatility without technically accusing him. The floorboards above us groaned under heavy, dragging footsteps, signaling that the master of the house had finally risen from his drunken slumber to face the day he would lose everything. I heard the sound of water running, followed by a loud curse as he likely tripped over something, then the heavy thud of boots on the stairs, each step vibrating through the house like the approach of a thunderstorm. Richard appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled and greasy, his eyes bloodshot and puffy, wearing a silk robe that was stained with a dark spot of wine near the hem, looking like a fallen king in tattered vestments. He stopped dead when he saw the sheriff sitting at his breakfast table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, his brain struggling to process the scene through the thick, toxic fog of a hangover. "Miller?" he croaked, his voice scratching like sandpaper against stone. "What the hell are you doing here at this hour?" He looked at me, his eyes narrowing with sudden, vicious accusation, waiting for me to explain why I had allowed an intruder into his sanctuary without his express permission, his hand tightening into a fist at his side. I stepped forward with a fresh cup of coffee for my husband, placing it near his hand with a deferential nod, but he ignored it, his gaze fixed on the sheriff with a mixture of confusion and rising panic. "Elena invited me, Rich," Miller said calmly, taking a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. "Said you had some damage to the house you wanted me to look at, something about a wall?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound that lacked any real humor, and waved his hand dismissively at me. "Oh, that? Just a little mishap. Women exaggerate everything, don't they, Jim?" He reached for the coffee, his hand shaking slightly from withdrawal, and when I didn't move away fast enough to suit him, he snapped, "Well, don't just stand there hovering like a ghost, Elena. Get the sheriff some of those biscuits. Make yourself useful for once." He turned back to Miller, leaning in with a conspiratorial grin that made my skin crawl. "She's been so clumsy lately, breaking things, tripping over her own feet. I swear I have to watch her like a hawk or she'd burn the house down." Miller didn't smile back, didn't join in the boys' club banter that Richard was trying so desperately to establish. Instead, his eyes flicked to me, watching as I silently obeyed the command, my head bowed in a posture of practiced submission. I placed the plate of biscuits on the table, ensuring that the movement caused me to wince slightly, a small, sharp gasp of pain escaping my lips before I could suppress it. Richard rolled his eyes, grabbing a biscuit and stuffing it into his mouth, crumbs falling onto his expensive robe, completely oblivious to the fact that the sheriff's demeanor had shifted from friendly neighbor to professional lawman. "Anyway," Richard chewed loudly, talking with his mouth full, "since you're here, we might as well have a drink later, celebrate the new vintage, if Elena hasn't smashed that too." I retreated to the counter, turning my back to them to plate the eggs, and let a single tear roll down my cheek, knowing that Miller was watching my reflection in the dark window, seeing the fear that Richard was too arrogant to hide. The silence in the kitchen stretched thin and taut, a wire ready to snap as Richard continued to complain about the cost of repairs, digging his own grave with every word. I focused on the eggs, placing the poached whites onto the toasted muffins, covering them with the rich, yellow sauce, creating a dish that looked beautiful but felt heavy as lead in my hands. "Richard," I said softly, not turning around, my voice trembling just enough to sound terrified. "Sheriff Miller isn't here for a drink. He's here because I was worried about the noise last night." Richard slammed his mug down, coffee splashing over the rim, and spun his chair around to face my back, his face twisting into a mask of rage. "The noise?" he hissed, standing up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "You call the police because of a dropped bottle? Are you insane?" He took a step toward me, and I flinched, shrinking away from him, a reaction that was half performance and half instinct, drawing Miller's attention to the sheer size difference between us. "Sit down, Richard," Miller said, his voice low but laced with steel, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the table near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. Richard stopped, looking from me to Miller, his face flushing a deep, ugly red, realizing for the first time that he was not in control of this room. "She's lying," Richard spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's trying to make me look bad. She's always doing this, playing the victim." I turned around slowly, holding the platter of Eggs Benedict, and looked him in the eye, not with fear, but with a cold, dead stare that unsettled him more than any scream could have. "I'm not playing, Richard," I said, placing the food on the table. "I'm just serving breakfast." The air in the room was so thick it felt like we were underwater, the pressure building against my eardrums, the only sound the ticking of the clock and Richard's ragged breathing. He looked at the food, then at me, and I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes, the sudden realization that I was not the same woman he had beaten the night before. I had changed the rules of the game, and he was still trying to play by the old ones, unaware that he had already lost. I moved to the window, pulling the curtains back to let the full, bright light of the morning flood the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the dark circles under Richard's eyes. "We have more guests coming," I announced quietly, checking the driveway. "So you might want to clean yourself up, darling." Richard looked at me with pure venom, his hands clenching and unclenching, desperate to strike out but restrained by the presence of the law. "Guests?" he growled. "I didn't invite anyone. Send them away." I shook my head, picking up the coffee pot to refill Miller's cup, my hand steady now, the tremor gone. "I can't do that, Richard," I replied, "because they are family." At that moment, the sound of another car engine approached, a smoother, more expensive purr than the sheriff's cruiser, signaling the arrival of the Lowells. Richard's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as he realized his parents were about to walk into this tense, volatile scene. He looked down at his stained robe, then at the sheriff, then at the mess I had hidden but not cleaned, panic finally piercing his arrogance. I smiled internally, a fierce, burning triumph, as I walked to the hallway to greet his parents, leaving him trapped in the kitchen with the sheriff and his own guilt. The heavy oak door swung inward on its well-oiled hinges, revealing Eleanor and William Lowell standing on the welcome mat like twin statues of judgment, their eyes already scanning the hallway for dust before they even looked at me. Eleanor was dressed in a pristine, cream-colored suit that cost more than my first car, her silver hair coiffed into an indestructible helmet, while William stood beside her in a navy blazer, clutching a cane he didn't really need, but used to point at things he disapproved of. I forced a smile onto my face, ignoring the sharp pull of the bandage on my neck, and stepped aside to let them in, the movement smooth and practiced despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins like ice water. "Eleanor, William," I said softly, inclining my head in a gesture of respect that I knew they expected from the help, which is essentially how they viewed me. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Richard will be so relieved to see you." Eleanor stepped into the foyer, wrinkling her nose slightly, as if she smelled something rotting beneath the scent of lemon polish, and remarked, "He'd better be. Elena, dragging us out here at this ungodly hour for a brunch, had better be worth the drive." I closed the door behind them, sealing the trap, and replied, "Oh, I believe it will be unforgettable." I led them down the hallway toward the kitchen, walking with a slow, deliberate cadence that forced them to match my pace, the click of Eleanor's heels echoing like a ticking clock against the hardwood. As we approached the kitchen archway, I could hear Richard's voice raised in agitation, still trying to bully Sheriff Miller, unaware that his audience had just expanded to include the only two people whose opinion he actually feared. We stepped into the room just as Richard slammed his hand onto the table, shouting, "I tell you, Miller, she's hysterical! She's making it all up!" The sudden silence that followed his outburst was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room as Richard spun around and saw his parents standing there, taking in the scene with eyes that were cold and unyielding. Richard looked like a wreck, his robe stained with wine, his hair standing on end, and his face puffy with drink, standing in stark contrast to his parents' impeccable grooming and my own rigid, formal appearance. William Lowell tapped his cane on the floor, a single, sharp sound that cracked like a whip, and said, "Richard, you look like a vagrant. Explain yourself immediately." Richard stammered, his arrogance evaporating instantly into the pathetic stutter of a disappointed child, his hands fumbling to tighten the belt of his robe as if that could hide his shame. "Mother, father," he choked out, his eyes darting frantically between them and the sheriff. I didn't know you were coming. Elena didn't tell me. She invited you without my permission." He turned to me, his face twisting into a snarl, desperate to redirect their disapproval. "Get them out of here, Elena. Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them to leave." I didn't flinch. I didn't retreat. I simply moved to the coffee station and began pouring 2 more cups into the fine bone china that Eleanor had given us as a wedding gift, handling the delicate porcelain with hands that were steady as stone. "I couldn't do that, Richard," I said, my voice calm and conversational. "We are celebrating, aren't we? Besides, Sheriff Miller was just asking about the renovations you started last night in the dining room." Sheriff Miller stood up then, wiping crumbs from his mouth, and nodded respectfully to the Lowells, his presence adding a layer of official gravity that made William frown in concern. "Mr. Lowell," Miller said, tipping his head, "I was just telling Richard that in all my years I've never seen a man work so hard on his house that he'd forget to clean up the materials." The confusion on William and Eleanor's faces was palpable, a mix of irritation and growing unease as they looked from the sheriff's serious demeanor to Richard's sweating face. "Renovations?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp and skeptical. "Richard has never lifted a hammer in his life. What on earth are you talking about?" I placed the teacups on the table, the china clinking softly, and then I gestured toward the open archway that led to the formal dining room, where the morning sun was now hitting the far wall with brutal clarity. "He was very passionate about it," I whispered, touching my cheek as if remembering a caress. "He felt the room needed a splash of color, something to memorialize our 10th anniversary." Richard lunged forward, trying to block their view, his voice rising to a shriek. "No! Don't go in there. It's a mess. The maid hasn't come yet." But it was too late. William had already bypassed him, driven by a need to understand the chaos, and Eleanor followed, drawn like a moth to the flame of a disaster she couldn't look away from. I stood back, folding my hands over my apron, and watched as they walked into the dining room, the sheriff following close behind as a witness to the discovery. The gasp that escaped Eleanor's throat was not a sound of surprise, but a sound of horror, a visceral reaction to the violence that was splashed across the cream-colored plaster. The wall was a crime scene, a violent, abstract painting of dark purple wine mixed with the darker, browner smear of dried blood, with shards of green glass still embedded deep in the drywall like shrapnel from an explosion. The liquid had run down the wall in long, jagged streaks, pooling on the floor where I had deliberately left a few bloody rags and the shattered neck of the 1982 bottle. It didn't look like an accident. It looked like an assault, a frozen moment of rage that had been preserved for them to see in high definition. William stood frozen, his cane hanging loosely in his hand, staring at the blood that was clearly not wine, while Eleanor put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide as she turned to look at the bandages peeking out from under my dress. The connection was made in an instant, the dots connecting with a terrifying speed. The bruises I was hiding, the limp, the terror in Richard's eyes, and the blood on the wall. Richard ran into the room, breathless and desperate, waving his hands as if he could physically wipe the image from their retinas. "It's not what it looks like," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I slipped. The bottle slipped. She's trying to frame me. Can't you see? She did this to herself." He looked at his mother, begging for the blind loyalty she had always given him. But Eleanor Lowell was staring at the wall with the cold, hard realization that her son was not just a failure, but a monster. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt, and asked the question that sealed the coffin. "Richard, if you slipped, why is the glass embedded in the wall at head height?" The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the air in a tomb, as Richard realized there was no lie clever enough to explain away the physics of his anger. I stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the light of the kitchen, and finally spoke, my voice devoid of emotion. "He didn't slip. Eleanor, he threw it at me because I told him we shouldn't drink the wedding wine." Richard crumbled, his legs giving way as the weight of the truth crushed him, and he slumped against the doorframe, looking small and defeated. He looked at me, expecting to see triumph, expecting to see a gloating enemy. But I just looked at him with a profound, exhausting pity. "I cleaned the floor, Richard," I said softly, pointing to the spotless wood around the bloodstains. "Just like you asked, but I couldn't clean the wall. The stain is too deep." William turned to his son, his face gray and aged by 10 years in a single minute, and whispered, "You made her clean it?" The disgust in his voice was the final blow, a rejection more painful than any physical wound. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to condemnation, and for the first time in his life, Richard Lowell was completely, utterly alone in a room full of family. The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop, causing Richard to shrink physically under the weight of his father's disgust, his mouth opening and closing in a silent, fish-like gasp of denial. I stepped forward, the soft sound of my slippers scuffing the floor acting as a gavel in the sudden courtroom, and looked at the stain that resembled a Rorschach test of our marriage. It was the 1982 vintage. "William," I said softly, my voice devoid of the anger they expected. The year I was born, and the year Richard said produced the most complex notes of cherry and smoke. I turned to look at my husband, who was now trembling uncontrollably under the gaze of his parents, and continued. "He told me that wine is like love. It needs to breathe. It needs to be treated with patience, or it turns to vinegar." I reached out and touched the wall, my finger coming away stained with a sticky, dark residue that smelled of oxidation and iron. "But we didn't let it breathe, did we, Richard? We bottled it up until the pressure was too great, and when it finally exploded last night, it didn't taste like cherry anymore. It tasted like fear." Sheriff Miller set his coffee cup down on the table, the sharp clink of ceramic against wood signaling the end of the breakfast and the beginning of the procedure. He walked over to the wall, pulling a pair of latex gloves from his belt with a snap that echoed through the silent room, and extracted a long, jagged shard of green glass from the plaster. He turned to Richard, holding the shard up to the morning light like a diamond. "This isn't just a domestic disturbance, Richard. This is assault with a deadly weapon, and looking at the dried blood on this glass, I'd say we're pushing into felony territory." Richard began to shake, his hands trembling violently at his sides. "Jim, please, you know me. We play poker on Thursdays. This is just a misunderstanding between a husband and wife." Miller didn't blink, didn't soften. He simply reached for the handcuffs at the small of his back, the metal rattling like a chain of command. "I know the man who plays poker, Richard, but I don't know the man who throws bottles at women and makes them crawl through glass to save a floorboard." The metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting tight around Richard's wrists was the loudest sound in the world, louder than the smash of the bottle, louder than his screams the night before. He dropped to his knees, not in prayer, but in a desperate, pathetic attempt to reach my hem. "Elena, baby, tell them to stop. Tell them I didn't mean it." Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat and the grime on his unshaven cheeks. But they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity, the tears of a child caught stealing. "I love you. Elena, I'll change. I swear on my life. I'll go to therapy. I'll stop drinking. Just don't let them take me away." Eleanor turned her face away, unable to watch the disintegration of her son's dignity, her shoulders shaking with a silent, repressed sob of shame that she tried to hide behind a handkerchief. I looked down at him, remembering how many times I had heard those same promises whispered in the dark, usually followed by a gift, then a week of peace, then another explosion. "You don't love me, Richard," I said, my voice steady and cold as the winter frost that killed his vines years ago. "You love the way I look on your arm, and you love having someone to blame for your own failures." I slowly unbuttoned the top button of my dress, pulling the fabric aside to reveal the angry, purple-black bruising that bloomed across my collarbone and shoulder, a galaxy of pain that I had hidden until this exact moment. "Love doesn't leave marks like this," I whispered, forcing William to look, forcing Eleanor to turn back and witness the carnage on my skin. "Love doesn't make you walk on broken glass while you drink whiskey and watch." Richard stopped crying, his face going slack as he realized that his charm, his money, and his family name had finally hit a wall they couldn't buy a way through. He looked at the bruises, really looked at them, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes, not for himself, but of the monster he had allowed himself to become. Miller hauled Richard to his feet, the physical force necessary and rough, treating him like a common criminal rather than the master of the estate. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller recited, the words familiar and rhythmic. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they dragged him toward the door, Richard twisted back, looking at his parents with wide, pleading eyes. "Dad? Mom? Do something! Call the lawyer!" William Lowell tightened his grip on his cane, his knuckles white, and said to the empty air, "I have no son in this house, only a criminal who has disgraced this family." They didn't follow him out. They stood frozen in the dining room as the front door slammed shut, sealing Richard's fate and leaving only the echo of his desperation. I walked to the window and watched as Miller pushed Richard into the back of the cruiser, his head bowing low to avoid the frame. A final, involuntary bow to the justice he had evaded for so long. The dust from the sheriff's cruiser settled slowly onto the gravel driveway, returning the vineyard to a silence that felt heavier, yet cleaner, than the suffocating quiet of the years before. I stood on the porch, wrapping my arms around my waist as if to hold my shattered pieces together, and turned to face the two people who had inadvertently created the monster I had just banished. Eleanor and William Lowell were still standing in the hallway, looking like ghosts haunting a house they no longer recognized, their faces pale and drawn with the shock of a reality they could no longer deny. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes lingering on the bandages peeking out from my collar, and for the first time in 10 years, she didn't see a disappointment or a gold digger. She saw a survivor. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an apology or an excuse, but words seemed insufficient in the face of the blood that was still drying on the dining room wall. William simply nodded, a stiff, jerky motion that conveyed a profound sense of shame and placed a heavy hand on his wife's shoulder, guiding her toward the door. "We will pay for the lawyer," he said, his voice raspy and old. "But we will not pay for his bail, Elena. Do what you must to heal." They walked past me without touching me, as if my pain was contagious, and I watched their luxury sedan disappear down the long, winding road, leaving me truly, terrifyingly alone. When the taillights vanished around the bend, the adrenaline that had been propping me up like a steel spine suddenly evaporated, leaving my legs trembling and weak. I slid down the doorframe until I hit the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and the sob that escaped my throat was a raw, primal sound that had been suppressed for 3 years. I cried for the girl who had walked down the aisle believing in fairy tales. I cried for the woman who had learned to walk on eggshells, and I cried for the sheer exhaustion of having to be strong. The tears were hot and fast, soaking the front of my dress, washing away the facade of the cold, calculating avenger I had played all morning. I sat there for an hour, maybe 2, letting the sun track across the floorboards, listening to the house settle around me, realizing that the monster was gone, but the castle was still standing. Eventually, the tears dried into a tight crust on my cheeks, and I stood up, my body aching, but my mind clear. I walked back into the dining room, picked up the bucket of soapy water I had prepared the night before, and began to scrub the wall again. This time, I wasn't cleaning out of fear. I wasn't cleaning to hide his sins. I was cleaning to reclaim my home, scrubbing away his mark until the plaster was raw and clean, ready for a new coat of paint. A month allows for a certain amount of scar tissue to form, both on the skin and on the soul, turning raw wounds into silver lines of history. The house smelled different now, the cloying scent of stale wine and expensive cologne replaced by the fresh smell of sage paint and open windows. I had hired a contractor to rip out the dark oak flooring in the dining room, replacing it with a light, airy bamboo that didn't hide stains, symbolizing a life where nothing needed to be concealed. The wine cellar, once his sacred temple of fermentation, had been emptied, the thousands of dollars of inventory auctioned off to pay for my legal fees and the renovation. I kept only one bottle, the empty Chateau Margaux, 1982, with the broken neck, which now sat on the mantelpiece not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what happens when you hold on to something too tightly. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture I had rearranged, reclaiming the space that had been his domain. I slept in the middle of the king-sized bed, sprawling out my limbs without fear of waking a volatile beast. And although the nightmares still came, they were losing their teeth, fading a little more with each sunrise. I was no longer the curator of his life. I was the architect of my own. The drive to the county detention center was long and straight, cutting through the golden hills that looked so much like the vineyards of France, yet felt distinctly like American freedom. I sat in the visitation room, my hands folded calmly on the cold metal table, waiting for the guard to bring in inmate number 4920, a man who used to be my husband. When Richard walked in, clad in a bright orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with his complexion, he looked smaller, deflated, like a grape that had been left to wither on the vine. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, hungry look in his eyes as he scanned my face for any sign of the submissive wife he remembered. He sat down, picking up the phone receiver with trembling hands, and I did the same, the glass partition between us acting as the ultimate boundary that he could never again cross. "Elena," he breathed, his voice tinny and distorted through the speaker. "You look beautiful. Have you been eating? You look different." I nodded, my expression neutral. "I've been sleeping, Richard, and I've been breathing, which is something I couldn't do when you were home." He leaned forward, pressing his palm against the glass, trying to summon the old charm that had once beguiled me, but it felt hollow now, a performance for an empty theater. "I'm changing, Elena," he swore, his eyes filling with tears that might have been genuine or might have been another manipulation. "I'm in the AA program here. I'm reading the Bible. I realize now how much I hurt you." I listened to him, feeling a strange sense of detachment, like watching a character in a movie I had already seen the ending to. "I'm glad you're getting help, Richard," I said, my voice steady. "But you aren't doing it for me, and you aren't doing it to save us." He froze, the hope draining from his face. "What do you mean?" "I'm doing this so I can come home, so we can start over. I can be the man you deserve." I shook my head slowly. "There is no us anymore, Richard. I didn't come here to reconcile. I came here to say goodbye." I slid the divorce papers across the table, the legal documents crisp and white against the gray metal. "I forgive you," I said, and saw his eyes light up for a second. "But I forgive you for my sake, not yours, so I don't have to carry the poison of hating you for the rest of my life." He stared at the papers, then at me, realization finally sinking in that his sentence was not just the 2 years in prison, but a life without the woman he had tried to possess. He started to argue, to plead, to get angry, but I simply hung up the receiver, cutting off his voice, cutting off his control, and stood up to leave. I walked out of the prison without looking back, the sound of the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind me, sounding like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. The air outside was crisp and cool, smelling of rain and asphalt, and I took a deep lungful of it, savoring the taste of oxygen that belonged only to me. I got into my car, checked my reflection in the mirror, and saw a woman who still had scars, who still had fear, but who was no longer a victim. I drove back to the vineyard, not with the speed of an escape, but with the steady pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of soft pink and lavender, I sat on the back porch in my favorite rocking chair. The vineyard stretched out before me, the vines heavy with grapes that would soon be harvested. Not by Richard, but by a new team I had hired, people who treated the land with respect. On the small table beside me sat a glass, catching the last rays of the dying sun, filled not with the dark, complex red of a vintage wine, but with clear, sparkling ice water with a slice of lemon. I picked up the glass, feeling the condensation cool against my fingertips, and took a long, slow sip, tasting the purity, the clarity, and the simple, unadulterated flavor of life. There was no alcohol to numb the pain, no fermentation to cloud the mind, just the clean, sharp taste of reality. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves, a sound that was no longer a whisper of danger, but a song of peace. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was free.